My name's Dennis Kin. I'm the founder of Walking Almaty, a blog about urbanism and architecture in Kazakhstan's largest city, Almaty, as well as a project called Monumental Almaty, which is about documenting and researching and ultimately advocating for the preservation of what is called Soviet monumental art. And today I want to explain a little bit about what Soviet monumental art is and how it came to be in Kazakhstan. So first of all, let's try to define monumental art. It's a bit tricky when we're talking about this in English, at least, because it isn't quite a recognized phenomenon in English language, Western art, history, and criticism. The closest thing we really have is what is called public art. But when we think of public art, we generally think of contemporary sculpture or perhaps statues, and we don't really think about the things that are included in this phenomenon of Soviet monumental art. Monumental art, we can define as something like the synthesis of architecture and art. So when art is incorporated into a building or in some kind of built environment. An important thing here too is that the art should be figurative art. So if it's some kind of abstract art, we would tend to describe it as decorative art, right? So like some kind of patterns on a building wouldn't qualify as this monumental art. Monumental art can actually come in a variety of different media. So let's go through these one by one to try to understand what they are and how they were made. So we have mosaics, bas-reliefs, sgraffiti, murals, stained glass, parquetry, and tapestries. And I'll explain a little bit about what each of these are. Let's begin with mosaics because they are simply the most widespread, not only in Kazakhstan, but throughout the Soviet Union. So mosaics is an image that are made from smaller pieces that are set in a substrate. And those small little pieces are called tesserae. In the West, mosaics, tesserae, can often be made from glazed ceramic, and that's certainly used in Kazakhstan. But way more often, you see mosaics made out of this beautiful material that is called Smalti. Smalti, when you look at it, it looks like these small kind of colored stones. But what it really is opaque colored glass. It's cooked in these big kilns where you add different kinds of pigments to make different colors of glass. And it comes out in these big flat bricks. In Russian, they're called blini, or pancakes, because they kind of look like pancakes. And artisans would take these, use special tools, and break them up into smaller shards, and then take those shards and assemble them piece by piece into a mosaic. Obviously, this is very labor intensive. An entire team or brigade could be working on a mosaic for months. But the result is this image that is spectacular, both close up and far away, and that can last for a very long time in an exterior setting. The next medium we can look at is bas-reliefs. So bas-relief is any kind of sculptural work of public art in the sense that it is affixed to the plane of a wall, but it has a 3D element. So bas-relief simply refers to the depth of that relief sculpture. And bas-reliefs can actually be made from a variety of different materials. In Soviet monumental art, they're usually made out of concrete, simply because Soviet architects and artists were really interested in innovating with this material. But you can also find bas-reliefs that were made out of aluminum. So this entire kind of genre or medium that's called chikanka, where artists would emboss aluminum and other metals with a hammer and make a 3D image like that. They could be made out of wood, in which case it's just a wood carving that's made on a flat surface. Could be made out of plaster of Paris. So there's all sorts of materials that you could use to make bas-reliefs, but the idea is that it's a sculptural 3D element that is affixed to a wall. The next medium we can talk about is Scrafito. Now, this was really interesting for me to research because I had never heard of this before in my life. This is not a very popular medium where I grew up, but in Kazakhstan, it's quite common. And it has a really interesting history and technique to make it. Even the word is interesting, Scrafito. It sounds a lot like graffito or graffiti. And that's because etymologically, these words are related. Graffiti actually comes from, I think, the Latin to mean scratch, because people would scratch their name into a wall, right? Scrafito is also made by scratching using different layers of colored plaster. So an artisan will put up one layer of colored plaster, and then immediately after that, put another fresh layer of a different color on top of that. And they would scrape away that top layer to reveal the color underneath. And you can put 3 or 4 different layers of colored plaster to make a composition that has several colors in it. And the result are these very bold images with bold lines that are really have an interesting aesthetic and were made throughout the Soviet Union by the dozens, but yet this technique is rarely seen outside of the Soviet Union. So we've discussed mosaics, bas-reliefs, sgraffiti. One other technique that is quite common in Soviet monumental art is using glass. Now, in the West, when we think of stained glass, we tend to think of ecclesiastical art, so windows that are made for churches. And when you look at most stained glass in Europe, in North America, it's this very thin glass with very delicate details. But when you look at Soviet stained glass, it's quite different. It's chunky and bulky, and the aesthetic is quite different than what you're used to seeing. And that's because it's made using a different technique. It's actually what is called dalle de verre. From the French, that means chunks of glass. And it's made by using these very thick, almost slabs of glass that are poured into forms. So you take hot molten glass and pour it into individual forms. And then almost like you're making a mosaic, you take those different forms and you set them together in a substrate. So that could be epoxy resin, it could be concrete. But when you put all those forms, those big chunky slabs of glass together, you get these remarkable stained glass windows that in Russian are called litoy vitrage, which means stained glass windows that have been poured. And the result can be just breathtaking. In addition to these other media that we've discussed, of course, there's the most classic form of monumental art, the most classic form of public art, in the West at least, is the mural. But in the Soviet period, murals were actually not that widespread simply because most monumental art was made to be seen by the public in outdoor settings. So mosaics, made with these chunky Smalti tesserae can withstand the elements very well, especially in Kazakhstan where you can have very hot weather and very cold weather. Bas-reliefs made out of concrete can last for decades. But murals require a lot of work to keep them in fine condition. So they're better suited for indoor situations. So certainly you could find murals that are made with tempera paints and different kinds of materials, but murals were not that common. And nowadays it's harder to find any remaining murals because they are the easiest to destroy. All you need is a bucket of paint. You just paint over the mural and it's gone forever. Whereas a big chunky stained glass window, you really need a lot of work to demolish that. And same thing with mosaics and some of this other monumental art. So those are kind of the most popular forms of monumental art. Two other that we can mention is one called parquetry. This is kind of like a mosaic that's made out of wood. So the way this works is that you have this plywood, and on top of the plywood, there's a veneer of different kinds of wood. So by mixing lighter woods and darker woods, you can make this image out of the wood. And this was pretty rare because it takes a certain kind of knowledgeable artisan to put this together. There's only a handful of examples of this in Kazakhstan. And one last medium we could discuss is the tapestry. Tapestries are really neat because in Kazakhstan, the tapestry tradition kind of grew out of an existing textile tradition. Kazakhs were nomads who lived in portable tents called yurts, And the interior of yurts would be decorated with these beautiful, ornate carpets made out of felt and silk. And the tapestry tradition, thus, took these basic materials, for example, wool and felt, and made it into something more monumental and more modernist in style. So if before tapestries would have had, traditional ornament, in the socialist period, tapestries could depict figurative art. So, for example, you could have a large tapestry of cosmonauts or of socialist workers. And tapestries would be built to cover a certain wall and really look as if they're integrated with the architecture. Tapestries are something that I haven't documented that extensively, simply because there aren't that many of them left out in the wild. They're so easy to remove. You just unhook them from the wall, that a lot of the ones that were installed in Soviet buildings have now disappeared or maybe have entered private collections, and so they can be hard to find. You can certainly find them at Kazakhstani art museums, but outside of that, they're a rare sight. So we have these different media of monumental art, and what's really fascinating about this is that all these media kind of came together into one phenomenon of Soviet monumental art, and this became understood as a single genre, as a single form of art, where artists could be trained in all these various media, and they were called monumental artists, or monumentalisti. I think of them as kind of the Renaissance men of Soviet-era art, because these were people who went to special art academies in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, and they learned how to work in all these different media. So a single monumental artist would be trained in how to make mosaics and how to make murals and how to make stained glass windows. And then they would be shipped off to different cities throughout the Soviet Union, and they would work on creating this public art, this monumental art, in the different republics of the USSR. How then did monumental art come to Kazakhstan? Monumental art, Soviet monumental art, really had its heyday from around 1965 to around 1985. So let's understand, why did this really kick off in the 1960s? It's largely because of changes in official policy around Soviet architecture. So up until the late 50s, Soviet architecture was dominated by Stalinist architecture. Because under the reign of Stalin, Stalin had a certain style of buildings that he preferred and that were widespread throughout the Soviet republics. And Stalinist buildings were essentially neoclassical. So you see a lot of classical elements like big columns, and they look very much like the classical architecture of St. Petersburg and of Europe. It's much harder to incorporate monumental art into this setting. In the sense of the monumental art that we've been discussing. What you do see in Stalinist buildings are the occasional bas-relief. So in a city like Almaty, for example, you can find bas-reliefs by an artist named Ivan Vahek on school number 12, or atop the famous Abay Theater. But these bas-reliefs were quite limited in number. And it was only after Stalin died and architecture began to change in the Soviet Union in the direction of modernist architecture that monumental art really began to blossom as a distinct phenomenon. So with modernism, modernist art was spearheaded under Khrushchev, and what they said is, we want to build more simple, elemental, streamlined buildings that will reflect socialist values. So we're not going to have all the fancy ornaments of this neoclassical Stalinism, but we're going to have something a lot simpler. And so you get these classic prefabricated concrete buildings. The problem with these buildings often is that they can be quite drab, and they lack any kind of visual interest for the public. So monumental art was really a solution to this. How can we take this drab, minimal building and give the public, give the viewers, as it were, something to look at? And by incorporating mosaics and stained glass windows and relief sculptures, architects were able to make things a little bit more interesting. So starting in the mid-1960s then, these monumental artists were being trained in Russian art academies were being sent out to the different republics to incorporate this modern monumental art into modernist architecture. And in Kazakhstan, you first had just a handful of these specially trained artists in the 1960s. In the early 1960s, for example, there was a guy named Oleg Bogomolov, who graduated from a Russian academy, came to Almaty, and he worked with one of Kazakhstan's most famous graphic artists, Yevgeny Sidorkin, to make some beautiful works of art in Kazakhstan's capital. So at the Tselini cinema, for example, there's a beautiful Scrafito by Bogomolov and Sidorkin that was uncovered just recently. Or at Chuz, which is the children's theater in Almaty, there is a mosaic that they've made. So these guys were real pioneers. Two other pioneers of monumental art in Kazakhstan were a couple of artists named Kinbayev and Sivchinsky. Sivchinsky was a classically trained monumental artist who went to art school in Ukraine and actually came to Almaty to start the Tapestry workshop. Kinbayev was mostly an oil painter, but Kinbayev was partnered up with Sivchinsky to produce some of the first mosaics in the Republic. The most famous example of Sivchinsky and Kinbayev's work can still be found on a iconic building in Almaty, the Almaty Hotel. So on the outside of the Almaty Hotel, there's this beautiful mosaic called Yenlik and Quebec, made by Kinbayev and Sivchinsky, that depicts scenes from a Kazakh opera that played at the Abai Theater just across the street. So we have these pioneers like Bogomolov, Sidorkin, Kinbayev, Sivchinsky, and then all of a sudden we get this injection of fresh young talent from the Russian art institutes, of properly trained monumentalists that are being sent out, delegated out to the different republics, and they're arriving in the late 1960s. Perhaps the most prominent of this new wave of young monumentalists is a gentleman named Vladimir Tverdokhlyebov. And Tverdokhlyebov eventually became known for such landmarks in Almaty as the Eastern Calendar Fountain, or for the mosaic at the Theater of Young Artists in Almaty's micro-districts. But Tverdokhlyebov and his cohort really established themselves with a building at the Academy of Sciences that's called the House of Academics, Dom Uchonych. And inside this one building, there it is like, I think of it as like a temple of Soviet monumental art. Tverdokhlyebov on the top floor made one of my favorite works of monumental art in the entire country, this stained glass window, Dao de Verre chunky window that is just opposite a place called the Winter Garden. And when you look at it, it's showing images from Scythian art, which is some of the most ancient representative art in Kazakhstan, mixed with images of traditional Kazakh nomadic life, all in beautiful colors. And when the light shines through it, it really is something to behold. In the same building, Tverdokhlyebov installed a variety of mosaics in what are called the Roman mosaic style. So this is using very, very, very small sliver tesserae of Smalti, showing 6 different figures from the history of Kazakh science and scholarhood. That's on the first floor. And one of the most remarkable works that Tverdokhlyebov and his team put together was in this large auditorium in the building, where they made this massive mosaic showing the head of Vladimir Lenin. And what's remarkable about this one is that it's not made using Smalti, but it's a special kind of mosaic that's called Florentine Mosaic. And these Florentine mosaics use polished stones. So it almost looks like this kind of polished marble. But they used all different kinds of stones from around Kazakhstan. And all these polished stones come together to create this face of the Soviet leader. And it's quite a remarkable work of art to take in. But for most of the last year since Kazakhstan's independence in 1991, this mosaic was covered up. So this brings us to kind of the most recent chapter in the art of Kazakhstan, the monumental art of Kazakhstan, is this period since independence. Because once the Soviet Union broke up, what happens to all this work of art that was made during that socialist era. There's quite an ambiguous attitude towards these works of art. On one hand, the public certainly appreciates it, and a lot of people realize that they should be preserved. But as we can see in the case of this Lenin mosaic, a lot of the themes that were showed there are simply not relevant to modern society anymore. Lenin does not have the same status that he did during the socialist period. So for most of this last period, Lenin was completely covered up with a board. And it's only when some colleagues of mine started to negotiate with the Academy of Science to open this back up that actually we realized that Lenin was still there. I understand the complicated relationship of the public with this socialist era. And we have to understand the sensitivity that a lot of viewers would have to works of art from this period. But I see it as something that has quite a lot of educational value so that today's generation can understand what the last generations were living through under the Soviet Union. So that Lenin, for example, if we put it in context and we show it to viewers, I think it's a very useful way to understand the ideology and the period that it was made in. So it certainly shouldn't be destroyed, certainly shouldn't be taken down. It could be covered up maybe with a curtain for when they have special events, but let it be seen and let it be known. And that's generally my philosophy about this Soviet monumental art, is that ultimately it's a reflection of its period that has a lot of historical value and cultural value. And it really ought to be preserved whenever possible, whenever it really can be recognized as something with value to the public. Soviet monumental art, of course, relied on this entire system to produce it. So the centralized economy of the Soviet Union, the educational system that was producing these artists. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, in a way, so did this whole genre of art. From the 1990s into the early 2000s, those first years of Kazakhstan's independence, you see a much smaller number of works. But what's remarkable is that in the last 10 years, we've seen an emergence of new public art in Kazakhstan, but an entirely new global idiom of street art. So no longer are artists using the old materials of Smalti and stained glass, but instead they're working with spray paint. And I think this is really neat because it reflects the interests and trends of youth and of global culture, and it's kind of breathed new life into public art in the country. But at the same time, I still think that Soviet monumental art has a certain beauty because of the materials that were being used and because of the artistry and the craftsmanship that was involved. So if I could take off my hat as an academic and look at this as more of an activist and as a critic, I would encourage Kazakhstani artists to try to return to some of these media that were being used in the socialist era. So why not, in addition to having spray paint street art, we could also have street art, again, that was using mosaics or using Scrafito or using all these different materials. So in addition to kind of encouraging the return of these monumental art techniques, I also really fight for the preservation of works of Soviet monumental art in Kazakhstan. Because I see, as someone who's not from Kazakhstan, I grew up in Southern California, that this is an amazing phenomenon that can really only be found in the former Soviet Union. And it blossomed in Kazakhstan in a way that actually could not be seen in a lot of other socialist republics. So this is something that is really unique in world art history, but it's in danger of being lost. Because if these buildings were previously public buildings, now they're in private hands and private owners can do whatever they want with them. So what we see is that a lot of mosaics are destroyed. Most recently in Almaty, a prominent mosaic by Vladimir Tvortoklebov, which was made in the 2000s on a restaurant, was just totally destroyed right on the city's main street. And what I like is that nowadays we're seeing actually the public is really responding to this in a way that says, we don't want to destroy public art. We don't want to destroy these mosaics and this monumental art, but we want to see them preserved. So I hope through my work, I can create more interests and more public investment in this phenomenon because I do think that it's something that's worth saving.